Now we have on our schedule Joseph Tennis, who is not here with us, but Corinne Rogers will present in his name. Corinne was presented earlier on, so I will just briefly mention that the topic will be the ideal, the real, and the way forward. Archival metadata in the contemporary distributed environment. Corinne?
Thank you, Herboy. Okay, as Herboy said, I am not Joe Tennis. And it's in a different place this time. Okay. So I think everyone is quite tired. It's been a very fascinating day, but I'm sure that no one will be disappointed if I go quickly. So I'm going to present this presentation, give this presentation. I'll be quite brief, and I want to give you a chance to ask questions of the other presenters. Anything that is not clear in this, as Mpo said, you know, I am just the messenger. Please don't shoot me. So this is about archival metadata, and it is a study that is not actually quite finished in InterPARES Trust and builds directly on a study that Joe and I did together actually in InterPARES 3. So metadata is defined in the terminology database, the InterPARES terminology database, as a set of machine and or human readable assertions made about a record or a body of records. Archival metadata specifically is used in support of preservation of records presumed to be authentic. And this is because, as we've heard several times today, authenticity is based on the identity and integrity of the record, and identity and integrity can be determined through metadata. So to date, InterPARES research projects have made quite strong claims about identity and integrity of records. And as Luciana told us this morning, in InterPARES 1, the benchmark and baseline requirements were developed. The benchmark requirements for the creation of authentic records, and the baseline requirements for the presumption of making authentic copies of records. And the elements of these give us elements of metadata for identity and integrity. In InterPARES 2, the chain of preservation model maps the entire life cycle of records from creation and actually from development of the records system right through to preservation of records. And in InterPARES 3, we conducted a general study to develop the InterPARES authenticity metadata application profile that drew all of these together in a set of ideal elements of metadata that, if applied to records, would assure that their authenticity could be presumed and shown. So the IPAM is a comprehensive listing of these assertions, these elements of metadata that can be made about records and aggregations of records from the point of creation right through the life cycle, across the threshold of preservation, and documenting disposition as well as access for records that are preserved. So there are 428 unique and repeatable terms in the IPAM, and you can just imagine how much fun it would be to apply them all. So this can be seen as an ideal set of metadata, not a realistic set of metadata. And in fact, the more controls you have on the process of creation, of management and preservation, the fewer of these you actually would need in order to presume authenticity, where the fewer controls you have on the records, the more you would need and the less you would probably have. So yes, it's easy to see how this may not be implementable without a bespoke system that applies all of them. So in InterPARES Trust, the question was to see what metadata was being used in the field to presume authenticity in active records management environments and archives. And this led us to a set of research questions. The first one, what are the ideal and realized requirements for authenticity in systems with suspect or unclear controls? And from that, we can expand to the cloud environment, which was the focus of InterPARES, is the focus of InterPARES Trust, because we don't have clear controls, and if authenticity is based on evidence of identity and integrity, then metadata has to figure in at some point. So what are the ideal and realized requirements for this metadata? Ideal, according to our modeling, exercises based on theory, and realized in practice by archivists and records managers in the contemporary networked environment. And of course, once you move into the cloud, you have the added layer of management metadata that is applied by the cloud service providers that you may or may not, probably not, have access to. The second research question, what new metadata requirements surface from this new systems context? And the expansion, is it possible that the models and the metadata derived from our models, from the benchmark and baseline requirements and from the chain of preservation model, is it possible they won't match the requirements for maintaining identity and integrity of records over the life cycle in the cloud environment? And if so, what do we need? So, a floating research question, what are the minimal set of IPAM metadata assertions that work in practice? So can we take that ideal set of 428 assertions, figure out what else might be needed in this new systems environment, and then distill that down to a minimal set? Yes, I think I've said all that. So in order to address these questions, we carried out 3 lines of inquiry. We had 3 phases. One was grouping the assertions of the IPAM into categories and developing a matrix to understand them better and make them a little more a little easier to understand than a whole list of 428 over a linear progression. We aligned this with the Bagger tool. So the Bagger specification is a Library of Congress specification for transfer of records, and it encapsulates records and their metadata together. And we worked with a particular institution and a person who was using and implementing this Bagger specification. And then mapping interview and document analysis of case studies. So we conducted case studies and looked at what was actually happening in practice. So this presentation, the remainder, will just focus on number 3, this mapping of interview data. So 3 sites were chosen for the case studies. 2 of them were within Library and Archives Canada, and another was within a university environment in Canada, not University of British Columbia. And they were purposely chosen, first of all, because they agreed. They had records professionals who were well-versed in the InterPARES concepts of authenticity. They all had people who had worked on previous phases of InterPARES. They were designing or using systems to preserve authentic digital records, and they were available for interviews and document sharing. And the data that we uncovered were quite rich, and there were a few surprises, which is good. There were many things not represented in the IPAM that were used and useful to records professionals. File names turned out to be more meaningful than we had assumed, and integrity far outweighed identity in most contexts in terms of assessing authenticity because of current system functionality. So, some of the things that were not represented in the IPAM that were used and useful to records professionals, we found that there were some key dates, types of dates in the IPAM that were missing. So things like dates of checksums. So checksums are not something that have previously been considered, right? And now they become very important in establishing integrity. So the checksums themselves, the dates of checksums, dates of preservation copies, things like this were missing. We didn't account for file size in metadata, so that was an important thing that's often captured. And since integrity was so important, we also observed the need for reports on integrity checks. So these are just some of the things that needed to be added. Then it was interesting that file names were used in such a meaningful way. So they were often used as part of the archival bond for establishing that archival bond, and it's a bit of a challenge since file names are so easily changed. So that was something that needed to be dealt with. And then about integrity, because some of the records professionals were managing records that were created elsewhere and on a variety of different systems, the integrity metadata, if present at all, was not usually ingested from a structured database or other systematic management system. So as long as checksums came back identical, then records professionals tended to be confident in presuming that they were managing authentic records. So the checksum became the substitute for other indicia of integrity. So the way forward, this is still ongoing for a number of reasons. It's been very slow. And it's a little bit like the shoemaker's children always going without shoes. I've been hounding all of the researchers to get their final reports in, and I'm guilty with Joe of not having ours finished. Next steps include removing redundancy from the ideal metadata application profile to more closely match what we see in the field data. And the hope is to present records professionals with both the ideal but also with something more real that can be used and worked with in a realistic way that won't be just an overwhelming, unrealistic expectation that no one will ever follow. And that's it. Thank you very much.